The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I am so excited to welcome back once again, Sophie Bacchus-Waterman. Sophie, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me again for a third time. Yeah, it's great. I'm going to be old hat now at this point.
You are. You're going to be one of my regulars at this. If we can continue to come up with topics, I will keep inviting you back.
I'd love to. It's great. I really enjoy our chats. I'm very glad to be back.
I do too. And today we are talking on a subject that I think kind of surprised me because you recently had an article published or is going to be published. I guess I don't remember which one.
No, it has been published. It's out online. It was published on the 22nd of November, but it's not out in physical copy yet. It won't be out until December.
Okay, so recently published on a subject that I don't think I've really covered very much on the show, other than maybe many, many, many years ago at the beginning. But today we're going to talk about like the mother of maids, kind of, and one in particular that you've kind of been able to trace and figure out who she is. So why don't we start off by the topic of your article and why this was of interest to you?
Yeah, of course. So the article happened completely by accident. It was in connection with my biography of Elizabeth Boleyn that some of your listeners might know I'm currently writing. And the article is about the identity of the mother of maids during Anne Boleyn's queenship, a woman who has been known to history as Mrs. or Mistress Marshall. So it was completely by chance that I found her identity, and it's actually thanks to the help of Barbara Soberton, who you had on recently. She and I worked together early on to work out this woman's identity, and then it became my article that I ended up writing and doing further research on. So yeah, it's very exciting to have found this woman's first name, a little bit about her family, a little bit about her children, where the Marshalls lived. For me, it was so important to recover her name. You know, really that was the purpose. As soon as I found out that that's what I had done, then it was very much like, how do I go about proving that Mrs. Marshall is the same Mrs. Marshall that I think she is?
Yeah.
So that was the subject of the article.
So before we go into this research that you have done, maybe you can explain to the listeners what exactly the Mother of Maids was and what her role was.
Yeah, of course. So it was a role in the Queen's household. We know of two women who had it during Henry's reign, two women who were the mother of maids to the English maids. And there is an important difference there, but I'll talk about that in a bit. So it was a role that seems to have been held by a more mature woman in the Queen's household, whose job it was to kind of oversee the maids, the younger women who served the Queen, probably the unmarried women. They were sort of in charge of morality, and I sort of think of them almost as like teachers. They were in charge of morality and dress and etiquette and sort of keeping the young women who served the Queen in line. So it was an official role that had a title. And when you look in court documents from Henry's reign, the term is Mother of Maids, or sometimes Mistress of Maids, Mother of Maidens. It's quite interchangeable. But they were essentially the people who were in charge of keeping the women in line in the Queen's household.
Okay, and so we're talking about the Mother of Maids under the reign of, I don't even know if saying under the reign of, but in the household.
Maybe in the queenship of, maybe in the household of. Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? You don't really say reign, do you? But no, I know. Yeah.
So how does somebody obtain a role such as this?
It's difficult to say, really, because we don't find evidence of Mrs. Marshall in that role, or indeed, I don't think anybody in that role. And then they work themselves up. It's not like you see Mrs. Marshall as a lady in waiting and then she becomes a Mother of Maids. In all court records, that is her title. So it's possibly that it's a family connection, you know, like often with the Queen's household. The roles were particularly coveted and really sought after and really difficult to get. So much like today, who do you know? Nepotism, perhaps who you're related to. Which was a key central part of my case, because I believe that Mrs. Marshall knew Elizabeth Boleyn, which was the central core of my paper and this research. It seems to be like lots of household appointments. You came from if not a noble family, then high up enough that you were able to, gain that kind of access to the Queen, that you were trusted enough. It's really who you know, it seems like.
And from your paper, I kind of gathered that you're under the impression that it wasn't as common for the mother of a queen to have so much influence in maybe helping fill positions.
It's really hard to say, isn't it? Because we don't have many examples of the mothers of English queens from this period. You've got, because most queens were foreign at this point. So the mothers weren't there to influence appointments in the Queen's household. And we just don't have the evidence for example, Anne de Beauchamp or Beauchamp, never quite sure how to pronounce that one, the mother of Anne Neville, Richard III's wife, for example, recently, Elizabeth Woodville's mother, Chiquetta of Luxembourg. We just don't have the evidence from their times as the mother of the Queen to suggest that they were particularly influential in the appointments in their daughters' households during their daughters' queenship. But with Elizabeth Boleyn, she was in Catherine of Aragon's service for several years, for over a decade. So perhaps she was able to lend that expertise to household appointments. Perhaps Anne asked her to, or perhaps the other Queen mothers also did have influence over who their daughters appointed. We just don't have the surviving evidence to suggest that.
Yeah.
That's
so true, right? Because the women in history are often they're overshadowed by the men. And
I think so. And I think also it's to do, sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you. It just came to me. I think it's also to do with, it's Eric Ives. I've just been writing about this, actually. I've been editing the book and writing about this, thinking about this. Eric Ives talks in his Anne Boleyn biography about how it's difficult to see Anne during her queenship because her records are subsumed into the king's household. In some instances, it's harder to see her influence once she becomes queen. And so it would be doubly so for the mother of the Queen. So, it just doesn't generate the kind of paperwork that survives. So if Elizabeth Boleyn was there suggesting, such and such a person join Anne's household, if there was no paperwork to suggest that, then we have no surviving evidence. We do have one really intriguing example, though, from Elizabeth Barton, who your listeners might know, the Holy Maid of Kent, who caused an awful lot of trouble for Henry and Anne during Anne's rise to power. And she claimed to be a prophetess. She was in the first series of Walpole, off the top of my head, I want to say, which is, back on telly. And so Elizabeth Barton was arrested for making these prophecies against Henry and Anne and the marriage, and claiming she spoke to God and all sorts of things. And then in her own, it's not confession, I can't think of the word. We'll say confession. That's not the word.
I was going to say deposition or.
Thank you, deposition. That's it. In her deposition, she says that, and I can't remember the exact wording, but the gist of it is that the Queen wished her to serve in her household at the request of my lady, the Queen's mother. So basically, Elizabeth Boleyn suggested to Anne, let's have Elizabeth Barton in your household. And why would she do that? And that was just fascinating. It's something that I've seen other historians talk about, but no one's really sat with that and thought, why would Elizabeth Boleyn want Elizabeth Barton, a dangerous political religious figure, in Anne Boleyn's household? And I think that it actually speaks a lot to Elizabeth Boleyn's political understanding and the canniness of serving the Queen. Because if you think back generation earlier to Catherine Gordon, the wife of Perkin Warbeck, after Perkin Warbeck was arrested, Catherine Gordon entered the service of Elizabeth of York and then became a lady to Elizabeth of York. And what that did is send a very public message that the threat of Perkin Warbeck was neutralized by his wife serving in the Queen's household. Similarly, if you put Elizabeth Barton in Elizabeth Boleyn's household, it says this threat is neutralized. She now has been consumed by the Tudor regime and is now serving the Queen. She is no threat to the regime. So I think that in making that suggestion, Elizabeth Boleyn was actually suggesting something particularly politically canny and particularly savvy. Yeah, it's very interesting.
I remember thinking it's like keep your enemies closer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, keep your enemies close. Yeah, absolutely. It just sends a message, it sends a message. This person is no longer a threat. So that's the evidence that we have that Elizabeth Boleyn was involved in some way in the household appointments of Anne, because she made that suggestion. It didn't come to pass, but the fact that we have evidence that she made that suggestion in this one instance suggests that it might have happened elsewhere, which I think brings us quite nicely to Mrs. Marshall and that connection as well.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about how you discovered who this woman actually was, because that's not an easy feat to be able to find some records. So how did you do this?
Completely by chance. So it's very unglamorous and normal. I did the trick that I think a lot of historians probably secretly do, but maybe don't admit to doing, which is the old Google Books method. You just Boolean search, so, do quotation marks, a bunch of keywords to do with anything that you're looking at. And especially if you're looking for records with early modern spellings. So you try all different variations. So I tried, Countess of Wiltshire, Countess with an E on it, different variations of the word Wiltshire, Lady of Wiltshire, Lady Wiltshire, Elizabeth Boleyn, Boleyn spelled all manner of ways. And you don't know what you're going to come up. What I found often was letters and papers, which is pretty understandable. Elizabeth Boleyn is referred to throughout those as my Lady of Wiltshire. So that came up quite a lot. But I found from the 1970s, it was a transcription of a will that mentioned the lady of my good lady of Wiltshire is the direct quote. And I was like, what's that? So I popped to the Radcliffe Library in Oxford and found and tried to look for, because they had copies of this. It was I think it was the Bedfordshire Historical Records Society that had transcribed a bunch of wills. They had at the Radcliffe Library, they had all of these copies of this society's journals, except the one I needed. But lucky enough, it was digitized. So take a look and find it on the computers at the Radcliffe Library, a transcription of the will. Once you have the shelf mark of that will, it's just downloadable for free on the National Archives. So you download that, and when I read it, it's the will of William Marshall, a man called William Marshall, who it has no relation, as far as I can tell, to the famous William Marshall of the Middle Ages. This is something completely different. William Marshall of Bedfordshire. And in that will, he places his daughter, Elizabeth Brocas, into the care of my good lady of Wiltshire, who would have been Elizabeth Boleyn. So then you ask the question, who's William Marshall and how does he know Elizabeth Boleyn?
Yeah.
And it was Sylvia who, when I put this to her and I said, it's really interesting, who's this Marshall character? And then she said, that might be Mrs. Marshall, because in his will, William Marshall mentions his wife, Mary. And it was Sylvia who first made that connection and said, maybe it's Mrs. Marshall. But you can't just go on that. That's not enough. Right. So then you've got to look into the Marshalls of Bedfordshire. And so that then led to what then became the article, is trying to find a connection between the Marshalls of Bedfordshire and the Boleyn family. And it turns out there's some evidence to suggest that those two families knew each other.
It's seriously, it's so important to collaborate with other historians, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I cannot stress enough, if it wasn't, I might have come to that conclusion. I probably would have come to that conclusion by myself eventually. Yeah. But it was that conversation that led to it. I've been so fortunate during the writing of this biography to have had the help of so many historians. I think there's this, I think I talked about it when I was last here, this romanticized idea that history is a lone endeavor, that, it's one figure down in some dusty archive somewhere digging up things. Sometimes it is, but the best history is done collaboratively. You can't know everything. I'm proof right now as I'm here talking that I forget things. People forget things. You don't know everything. This is a collaboration. I think all of history is a collaboration, and to suggest that it's just one person doing one thing, that's what acknowledgements are for. That's what book acknowledgements are for, to say, I didn't do this alone, and this paper was not done alone. It was Sylvia who pointed out that connection in the first place. And then I took that away and said, okay, if this is the case, then how did this family know the Boleyns? And it ended up being the paper. And it was very exciting and very fortunate for that collaboration.
I love that. And for someone who loves collaborating with other people, I love when I can use the knowledge that I've obtained over the years to help somebody too. It's not very often that Seymour information comes into play. I just had this happen.
Yeah.
I think it was yesterday or last night with somebody who
Yeah.
mentioned a specific location. And then I said, oh, that was actually owned by Thomas Seymour before that person. And they were like, no way.
Oh, yeah, see, that's great. You never know. See, firstly, Seymour information should come up more in conversation, justice for the Seymour family and Jane Seymour. And let's talk more about that. I can't wait for Elizabeth Norton's academic biography of Jane.
I am so
excited.
excited.
Yeah, you must be. I think it's a couple of years off yet, but very excited for that one. Yeah, it's always a collaboration, always. Particularly, in undiscovered histories or overlooked histories. When you're not retelling the story of these great men, people like Thomas Cromwell or Cardinal Wolsey, and of course there's always new research to be done, but when you're trying to find information on overlooked figures, I would say even more in that case, you need collaboration, even if the collaboration is antagonistic. Look at Matt Lewis and Nathan Armin,
Yes,
and research that's come from that ongoing debate about the fate of the princes in the Tower. It requires two people, in that case, and more people, an ongoing discussion. Yeah, always. I feel that very strongly.
I like that too. And I love how it's Matt, Nathan, and now Nicola Tallis too, with the Margaret Beaufort, tale of it. And then on my episode that went out today, I interviewed Dr. Lacey Bonar Hull about the women who are surrounded around the mystery of the princess. And that opens up another door.
As soon as I haven't listened to that episode yet, but I will tell you, I'm going to fangirl a little bit. As soon as I saw that episode and I went, oh, that's exciting. I downloaded it. I have not listened to it yet, but very excited to listen to that one. I'm sure it's fantastic.
I hope you have the mind-blowing experience that I had, because there was something that Lacey revealed in that episode where I was like, you have got to be kidding me. How have we never talked about this before?
Oh, that's very exciting. I can't wait to listen. Yes. Again, we're plugging another episode of your podcast in this one.
This is what you do, right?
That's what you do. Absolutely. Everyone go and listen if you haven't already.
It was a fun one. Anyway, let's get back to Mrs. Marshall.
Yes, we took a massive detour there. I apologize.
No, don't apologize. I love detours. That's what my show is all about. We just go all over the place and we eventually come back to the topic at hand. But so you discovered who Mrs. Marshall was. Yes. So now we know who she is. What were you able to learn anything about her and her life?
Yes, so mostly it's her surroundings and her family. And I think that I will preface this by saying the one thing this research did do is show how difficult it still is to find information about women in particular. I desperately wanted to find her maiden name, which I wasn't able to locate. I wasn't able to find evidence of her after she left the Queen's service. But in terms of what I was able to find, so that's the negative stuff. But what I was able to find, she was married to William Marshall of Bedfordshire, and they lived in Dunstable Priory, which was one of the first connections that I made between that family and the Boleyns, was that the Boleyns owned Luton Hoo, one of their properties in Bedfordshire. So that was a geographic connection immediately between the two families. And Mrs. Marshall had this role in Anne's household, seemingly from January 1534 is when she first turns up in the records. And then she maintains that role throughout Anne's queenship. And then the day after Anne's execution, Thomas Cromwell, in one of his notes to himself, tells himself to remember the mother of Maids. And we assume that that is Mrs. Marshall, because if she got this role through her connection to Elizabeth Boleyn, then after Anne's queenship, she probably ended up like a lot of Anne's household, leaving the Queen's service. And then we next see another person in that role of mother of maids, a woman called Mrs. Stoner, whose identity is also unknown. She could be a couple of people, and it's been suggested that she's a few different women. The problem with these records is that they're referred to by their surname, Mistress such and such. And unless you know who that is outside of that, or if it could be several people, like in the case of Mistress Stoner, then you're not going to know unless we find a piece of evidence like this one about Mrs. Marshall, which connects the Marshall family to the Boleyns. Then these women's identities are just hidden. So I was able to find out, like I say, her husband. They had a couple of children. I'm just going to pull up my list now because I did this research quite a while ago. So it's, yeah. And in the middle of writing a book and everything, it doesn't stick so much. So, yeah. So like I say, the Marshalls, they lived in Dunstable Priory, and her husband, William Marshall, was a lawyer. And he had a position in Lincoln's Inn in London. And then he passed away in 1531. And so this would have left Mary Marshall as a widow, which actually was a very good position for a woman to be in, because then you have access to your husband's funds. And he left a lot of money to his wife, and then he left some to his children as well. So William and Mary had several children, 2 sons and 3 daughters. And I was able to find out a little bit about their children. Richard Marshall, one of their sons, he was also a lawyer. And then Elizabeth Marshall Elizabeth Marshall Brocas was the wife of John Brocas, who died before William Marshall wrote his will. And then it was in the will, William Marshall was charging Elizabeth Boleyn with the new marriage of his daughter Elizabeth in the will, and he made her his executor as well, Elizabeth Boleyn.
Oh.
So yeah, able to find a little bit about one of the executors as well, along with his wife. So I was able to find out a little bit about the kind of Marshall family in general, a little bit wider. And then of course there's the connection to the Boleyn family as well. You've got the geographical connection between Luton Hoo and Dunstable Priory, where the Marshalls lived. And then you've got a couple of documents in which Geoffrey Boleyn is named alongside John Marshall, another member of the Marshall family from a previous generation. You've got William Marshall mentioned in an indenture with Henry Wyatt, who was the father of Thomas Wyatt, the poet. So you've got this kind of broader social connection between the Marshall family and the Boleyn family as well. I think that the Marshall family were just overlooked in that kind of broader network of the Boleyns.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me that I think we've talked about this before in an episode that we've done together, how important it is, especially when you're researching somebody like Elizabeth Boleyn or somebody who we don't know very much about, to look outside and the people around them, because it's once you, and it's always the men that you have to look at because that's where all the information is. But once you can start pinpointing their circle of friends or their circle of family, that opens up so many doors, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So much of this was, just trying to link the broader family, the 2 broader families, not necessarily saying, this is how Mary Marshall knew Elizabeth Boleyn, because we don't have that evidence. But it's mostly just saying this is this family, and this is the wider network. This is the kind of milieu, if you like, that they moved in, the social networks that they maintained. And it just makes sense. I think there's been a massive, that was badly worded. Let me start again. It's been overlooked, Elizabeth Boleyn's possible connections, because she spent a lot of time at Hever, and then she would have spent a lot of time at the other properties as well. And so she would have had to have maintained social networks, as women in her position would have done. Women whose husbands were away at court, who spent time running their households, would have needed local friends, traveled to see local friends, that sort of thing. And I think that's what this was, this connection between Mary Marshall and Elizabeth Boleyn. And this is pure speculation that didn't make it to the paper. But they had a house in Bedfordshire, near enough to Dunstable Priory. We don't know exactly where the Marshall family lived, unfortunately. I wasn't able to find that out. But those 2 locations are close enough that they could have potentially seen each other socially. It would have been important for Elizabeth Boleyn to maintain those kind of social networks locally in the various properties that she and Thomas had around the country.
Yeah, keep your friends close too, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So I guess I'm kind of intrigued by the idea that after Anne Boleyn's downfall, that this mother of maids left as well. Do you think that's because that's just how things worked, or because of her close relationship with the Boleyn family?
I think it must have been because of her close relationship with the Boleyn family. because it's just very interesting that Thomas Cromwell, on the 20th of May, 1536, he has a list of remembrances, and one of those is, I will find the direct quote. Yes, so he wrote a note to himself to say, to remember the Mistress of Maids. The day after Anne Boleyn is executed, he makes that note to himself. What does that mean? To remember the Mistress of Maids in what capacity?
Did she die?
Well, I mean, possibly, because she disappears from the records. That's the last evidence that I find of, and I'm assuming that note to the Mistress of Maids is Mrs. Marshall, because the last reference to Mrs. Marshall as the Mary Marshall as the mistress to the Queen's gentleman is in October 1534. That's when you can associate the name with the role. Mistress Marshall was the Mistress of Maids at that point. Then Cromwell says on the 20th of May 1536 to remember the Mistress of Maids. I'm assuming that Mistress of Maids is the same woman, is Mrs. Marshall. You don't know, because Cromwell didn't say, Mistress Marshall in that note. But it makes sense that it would be if we assume that Mary Marshall got that role because of her connection to the Boleyn family.
Yeah.
And then the day after Anne's executed, Cromwell says, remember. Remember what? We don't know.
So,
frustrating.
Where did you say you found this note?
It's digitized on the state papers online. So it's Cromwell had these lists of remembrances. He just had these to-do lists. He had several to-do lists. And it's one of his many to-do lists. And he's just got, remember such and such. It's very relatable. I think they are called Cromwell's remembrances, these little notes that he made to himself. And it's just a list of things to do. And on the 20th of May, he had a to-do list. And one of those things was remember the Mistress of Maids.
Okay.
He doesn't say, go on.
Here's my question to you then. Okay, in my modern day mind, right, if this is a list of things to do, is it possible that he's trying to remind himself to find a new Mistress of Maids? Like, when does Mrs. Stoner come into the picture? Do we know?
Yeah, so she comes into the picture in 1539. And so there's this gap where we don't know who the Mother of Maids was in that period.
Yeah.
We've got two Mother of Maids, two other women in this role. So you've got Mother Lowe, who was the Mistress of Maids during Anne of Cleves' queenship. And she seems to have joined the household. She seems to have travelled over in November 1539. And she was the mother of the Dutch maids specifically. She's mentioned in a letter written by Catherine Bassett to Lady Lisle, where she says particularly Mother Lowe, the mother of the Dutch maids. And then at the same time, you've got Mistress Stoner, who was the mother of the maids alongside her. There were two at the same time, probably because Anne of Cleves' household was mixed with some of her women who came over with her, and then some of the English women as well. So that's probably why you needed two people in that position at the same time.
Interesting.
Yeah. But we don't see Mrs. Stoner in that role until 1539. So there's a gap there. I would love to know who had that role during Jane Seymour's reign, during queenship. We're not saying reign, during Jane Seymour's queenship. I'd love to know who had that role.
Yeah, that's interesting.
There's a gap there.
Did you say, and I'm trying to remember in your paper, did you say something that there was more than one Stoner?
There was, so we don't know who Mistress Stoner was. Much like we don't know who Mistress Marshall was. She might have been Isabel Stoner, the wife of John Stoner. And it's also been suggested that she was Anne or Margaret Stoner, the wife of Walter Stoner. So she could have been several people. Maybe my next paper is who she was. I'd love to know who she was. But see, this is the problem. That was part of my conclusion of the paper. And at time of recording, by the way, I do have some free e-prints. It's behind a paywall, but I do have some free e-prints if anyone would like to read it. Part of the conclusion was pointing out that because of the way that the court records work, you just can't find these women's names unless they're named, because of the nature of, lady such and such, mistress such and such. You've got to look outside of those records to find who they are. And so that's why some of these women get anonymized, like Mistress Stoner, who could be several people because there were several women with the surname Stoner. And so which one was it? Because you've got Mistress Marshall, whose name is just not mentioned in these records. In every instance of her, even outside of court records, when she's mentioned in letters, she's mentioned just by her role. So it is the mother of the maids, I wrote to the mother of the maids, whatever it might be, Mistress Marshall. You don't have their first name. And so because you don't have their first name, their biographies are unrecoverable. And they're just anonymized by the nature of these records. Yeah, it's crazy.
And these women had to have some sort of qualification in order to hold this role. Like, do you have any idea?
Of the kind of qualifications?
Yeah.
Outside of kind of, who you know and being able to get that position. I'd imagine that because of the nature of the role, being taking care of the younger women, I'd imagine they would have been perhaps maturer women, probably with children of their own, they couldn't have had any stains on their character. They must have been particularly upstanding women who were highly regarded to be in this very public position of this recognized position of keeping law and order in the Queen's household. We have an example from William Latimer in his chronicle of Anne Boleyn when he talks particularly about the mother of maids. And he says that Anne used to, I can read the quote directly, I've got it in front of me.
Yes, do please.
So William Latimer writes, and that her ladies, maidens of honour and other gentlewomen should use themselves accordingly to their call, her grace would commonly and generally would many times move them to modesty and chastity, but especial to the maidens of honour, whom she would call before her in the privy chamber, and before the mother of the maids would give them a long charge of their behaviours. So after Mary Shelton was caught writing in her prayer book, Anne, quote, commanded the mother of the maidens to have a more vigilant eye to her charge, to the end that at all times, and in the times of prayer especially, they might humbly and virtuously behave themselves. So you've got William Latimer talking about Anne keeping order in her household through the mother of the maidens, and it was Mrs. Marshall, Mary Marshall's job to do that. When something went wrong, when someone wrote in their prayer book or seemed to misbehave, it was, like I say, almost like a school teacher, very much the person in this role, the role of the mother of maids to keep that order. And of course, William Latimer was writing a pro-Anne Boleyn book there. So he was trying to suggest that, a household was particularly orderly, that these women were particularly well behaved, that in instances where they weren't, Anne pulled them up on it, and gave them a long list of their charges, he says. So it's an interesting role. I think that it's the Queen's household publicly, the ladies in waiting, they served a very public, functional purpose to enhance the Queen's majesty when she went anywhere publicly. They all had to be well dressed. They all had to perhaps dress the same. They all had to be beautiful. And it was the mother of the maid's role to keep that public image, almost like a PR person, I guess.
Yeah.
Thinking about it.
And these young girls, we'll call them the maids, the purpose for them to be in the household, right, is to learn under these other people, to learn under the mistress of maids, and to meet husbands eventually, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And to find husbands as well. So yeah, it's very much like, be goodly, be godly, be proper, and then you'll find a good husband. So yeah, these women, whoever was in that role, and like I say, I'd love to find out who it was during Jane Seymour's queenship. I just don't think we have the surviving sources. Whoever was in that role, they must have been someone of kind of good character, who was highly regarded, and to be able to be trusted to be in that position, had probably proven themselves with their own family or their own children or daughters or whatever it might have been.
I hope you continue to look into this, who Jane Seymour's mother of maids could have been. I'm so curious, like what her religious inclinations may have been. I think that would tell us a lot.
I think so. Yeah, I think there's so much more work that can be done and should be done on the Queen's household and on Jane Seymour's queenship and on her household. There's this idea that, Jane's household was very staid and boring in comparison to Anne's household. And I don't think that's particularly true. I haven't done my own research into that, so I can't speak to it at any depth. But I think that we have a tendency to compare one wife to the other. So I think it would be very interesting to know more about that. Yeah, it's possible that the evidence is out there, it hasn't been found.
Right. Maybe it'll just take collaboration with somebody to be able.
You never know. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And who knows, like we say, Elizabeth Norton's book's coming out. So I'm sure there's going to be all sorts there. It's very exciting.
Oh my gosh. I think there's so many of us who are so excited about this research that she's doing, because I think so many of us want to know who the real Jane Seymour was.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. And I think there is a real movement, with biographies like mine, with this academic approach to Jane Seymour as well. This pushing back against centuries of thinking, these women are unrecoverable, or we don't know much. There's so much more there to know. You think about 10 years ago, I don't think an academic biography of Jane Seymour would have been attempted. The thought would have been, you can't do that. There's barely, and I think it was Elizabeth Norton's biography of Jane that was the first of its kind.
Yeah.
So there's a sea change, I believe, in our ways of thinking. It might not be traditional history as it's been understood. There might be different approaches. And we talked about this in my interview about my biography, different approaches to doing history, particularly when you're recovering the lives of marginalized figures who are marginalized perhaps in their lifetime, if you're talking about the lives of enslaved people or the lives of impoverished people. But then you've got the recovery of someone like Elizabeth Boleyn, who was, or Mary Marshall, who in their lifetimes were privileged, but have been marginalized by the archives and by the surviving sources. There's got to be another way to try and recover what we can. What survives. I think it's very exciting that there seems to be this movement towards this. It's great. I'll climb off my soapbox now.
No, I love it, because I think the technology that we have, how it's ever evolving, is only going to open so many more doors to evidence and more people with boots on the ground, so to speak, who are digging into different things. And just the collaborating and the technology, I think, is going to bring so much new information forward in the coming years.
I completely agree. I think that it's a very exciting time to just be a Tudor historian and to be kind of in this world where new discoveries are happening all the time. We've got the new portrait miniature of Mary I.
Yes.
Incredible.
Yes.
That's just amazing. There's all these, so there's a mixture, I think, of new discoveries which are constantly happening and new research which is being done. And I'm, keeping it under wraps at the moment, but I also have new research that's forthcoming over the next couple of years. And then you've got a change in how we're approaching the surviving sources, the kinds of questions we're asking, the kinds of people we're trying to look for, and making those connections. It seems to me to be very telling and almost quite poignant that I went looking for Elizabeth Boleyn, an overlooked woman in history, and then quite literally stumbled and fell over another overlooked woman. Just by looking for one, you find another. It's very exciting that this is happening. Yeah.
It is. And I love that you mentioned searching Google Books, because that is something I've done so many times in my research. And when you mentioned all the different spellings to use and using the quotation marks,
yes.
This is something that when somebody is starting their own research into a subject, I always mention using Google Books. And I think people kind of scoff at it at first. And I'm like, no, you have no idea how much you can find that way.
Yeah, completely. And then obviously, from there, you then go and do further research. That's not the end of it. But it was that led me to, and like I say, I believe that this Bedfordshire Historical Review, or whatever it was called, it was from the 1970s. So this will had been transcribed decades ago and then digitized on Google Books and then just left there and sat there, because much like the discovery of the Mary Queen of Scots letters when they found those quite recently, it was one of the researchers of that project who said, we couldn't have found this if we were looking for it. If you weren't looking for the identity of Mrs. Marshall, the mother of Maids, and Anne Boleyn's queenship, the traditional sources you would look at, the court records, would not give you that evidence. It's only by the digitization of this random, obscure historical societies book from the 1970s that I then found the will on the National Archives that then made the connection between the Boleyns, the Marshalls, and so on. I think there's this glamorization of like the idea of how research is done. You have to go into some archive and dig something out. No, I searched on Google Books, actually, variations of, that. It doesn't sound very impressive. Anyone can do it. But I'm a strong advocate of anyone should do it. I think that history is for everybody and should be accessible to everybody. And I've recently made the jump from Twitter to Blue Sky, and Nathan Armin put up a wonderful post the other day that he gets questions all the time about, how do I start projects? How do you start writing a book? And Nathan said, you just do it. Yeah. And I could not agree more. I'm sure that you feel the same with your own research. When you start out, you think, I can't do this. I can't perhaps overturn centuries of scholarly thought, or, I can't find things that people haven't found before. I'm just little old me. But then you do the work and you find it, and there's always something to look for, whatever it is you're passionate about, Thomas Seymour or Elizabeth Boleyn. You dig and you will find something. It's so exciting, I think, and possible. And yeah,
it's so
very preachy. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's so rewarding. Doing the research is some of the most rewarding stuff I've done in my entire life, because of the things that you come across that maybe somebody hasn't really put two and two together, that this is an important piece of research to your subject. Then it gets exciting. And then you want to it's addictive too, isn't it?
It's addictive. It's like being a detective. And then you start to put things together, and this is one small facet of a larger biography of Elizabeth Boleyn. This is one offshoot of that. But then within that book, and I realize I'm going off the topic now, within that book, there's all sorts of new discoveries and documents and overlooked things. And we talked last time about, just sending those emails to those institutes. What do you have on this, that, or the other? There could be some box somewhere that they don't know about, they haven't gone through or whatever. And it's putting all those pieces together to try and make a bigger picture. And sometimes it's not making new discoveries, it's just looking at old discoveries or collaborating with other people, because the history itself, the sources often don't change. What changes is our approach to them, the questions that we're asking, and who's looking at them. My research into Elizabeth Boleyn has been heavily shaped by what I'm interested in as a researcher, my life, my experiences. The book is shaped by my writing style, all of those things. So to think, well, someone else would do it better or someone else would do it different, but no one would do it the way you would do it. No one has those questions, wants to find those answers. And I think that's just so, inspiring and exciting. I think it should be open to everybody.
I love
Google Books as a method. It doesn't sound impressive, because well, anyone can Google something. Yes, but knowing what to Google, knowing how to find those things, the kind of information gathering that then leads, because it began with a Google Books search query, and then led to much more research at the National Archives, on State Papers Online. Excuse me. And that's where the historian part of it comes in, when you put those things together and create that picture. It's very exciting. And
I think when you're doing research, it's also so important to have people to talk to about it. If they're people that you can trust, of course. But I cannot tell you the number of times, if I didn't have my mentor, and that I wouldn't be able, if I couldn't trust her the way that I do, I wouldn't be able to go to her and say, hey, I came across this piece of information and here's some thoughts that I have. And then her feedback to me is, oh my gosh, yes, you need to dig more into this. I may have just overlooked it and moved on, but because I gave her the ideas that I had, she was able to validate that, okay, no, you're on the right track and you should dig a little bit deeper.
Absolutely. That's why the peer review process is so important. This article, it's my first published article. Yay, very exciting. But it's been through the peer review process, because it's been read and looked at by other historians multiple times before it gets to be in front of you. So that's why it's so important to have people check things, to have people question things, to be able to share it in, like you say, with people that you can trust, other researchers working on similar things. But then also that's why we have the kind of academic rigor of peer review process, or book reviews, or that sort of thing. I think that when you say kind of history is for everyone, I do believe that very strongly. But I also believe in, academic rigor and making sure that, that there's not a spread of misinformation, or the spread of, false facts. I can't, early on in my biography, when I lost the will sometimes, because it was such a massive project, and then I'd just think, oh, why am I doing this? Then I'd read some misinformation about Elizabeth Boleyn, of which there is a lot about. I cannot tell you how many portraits there are. Just any random portrait of a woman, and it's like, it's Anne's mother, and I'm thinking, no, it's not. Read that, and then it drives me crazy, and I think, okay, I have to put this right. I have to put this right. And I think it's wanting to be an advocate for the people of the past, and tell those stories. I know that your research is very much the same, but also being aware that you can only go so far with that, and not kind of over romanticizing it and thinking, I'm trying to be an advocate for this person, but ultimately I don't know what it was like to live 500 years ago. I can only ever allow the sources to take me as far as they will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like you and I just feel like every time we talk, we could just do a whole episode on research and the research process and what it's like to research for our book.
Oh, I'd love to. That would be great. I'd love to.
There's our next topic, right?
There's our next topic. Absolutely. Yeah. Because I feel like we haven't spoken much about the paper or Mrs. Marshall much, but I think we have. I think we've covered it. It's very exciting to be able to have restored this woman's name to her, and to have done the research that allowed that to happen.
Yeah.
I felt very strongly.
Great discovery on your part. Maybe great accidental discovery.
Thank you. Sometimes the best ones are. And I think as well, one final thing, this actually speaks to the importance of wills as well as documents and overlooked sources. Part of my conclusion in the paper is talking about wills and how important they are as a source of information. They're often overlooked, but you can sometimes find all you know from a will. I remember a while ago there was that big hubbub about they were going to destroy some wills. Did you see that?
Oh, I did not.
You remember? Gosh, oh no, I'm going to tell half the story now. I can't remember. I'm so sorry. There was a big thing a couple of years ago about I want to say one of the governmental departments in England had a bunch of wills, physical wills that had been digitized, and then there was a big petition because it was claimed they were going to destroy them. I don't know what ended up happening to that. So I will leave it there because I can't remember the whole story and I don't want to go telling half a story. But the point that I was trying to get to before I went off on a tangent that I couldn't remember, is wills are massively important sources and overlooked sources. In some instances, they are our only evidence that somebody lived, or our only evidence of what they owned, their family. A majority of the initial research that I did into the Marshall family was right there in William Marshall's will. He mentions his children, he mentions their husbands, he mentions money he gives to them, he mentions his properties, massively useful sources. And the National Archives, you can just go on there and download these wills for free. They're just digitized. Some of them are pretty dodgily digitized. They're not easy to read, but you have the shelf mark, you can go and see it. Yeah, they're wonderful resources. It was incredibly helpful. That was the basis of this research. That was the start of this research.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. I don't mean to talk about the Seymours again, but that's where I learned. You're like, more, please. I learned a lot about Margery Seymour, so the mother of Edward and Thomas and Jane. I learned a lot about her relationship with her children from her will.
Really? That's so interesting.
Yeah. So when I read that. Oh, yeah.
I didn't even know she had a will.
Yeah, I wrote an article for it on my website a couple of years ago or so. Maybe I'll share the link with you just so you can kind of see. Yeah. And it was just my interpretation of it was that she did not have a very good relationship with her eldest son, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset.
Very interesting. I would love to read that. Yeah, maybe you can pop it in the description of the episode. Yeah, I'm sure people.
No, this episode is not about Thomas Seymour or his family, but
it's tangentially related. It's about wills. You can, plug your own research. It's linked tangentially.
I always love to talk about Seymours.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, any excuse. But they're very important. Yeah, documents, and it can offer a lot of evidence about a lot of things. That I talk about wills. They're going to turn up in my Elizabeth Bullen book. Obviously, the basis of this paper was all around a will. The beginning, anyway, before you kind of branch out and look for other evidence of the family. Yeah, massively useful.
Sophie, it has been so fun to talk with you again today about the mother of maids and a bunch of other stuff, which I'm totally fine talking about all different kinds of things with anybody who comes on the show. But thank you for your time today and for sharing this information.
Very, very glad to be back and just happy to talk about it. Thank you so much. And until I'm back on, I'm sure.
Yeah, we're going to have you back on again. I'm going to have you back. So until next time, thank you, Sophie.
Thank you very much.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.